Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Food Defense and Intentional Adulteration of Food. This webinar will be hosted by Tim Lombardo of Eurofins Food Assurance. I'm Amy Knock, and I'll be moderating the webinar. Before we begin, I wanted to let you know more about how this webinar will run. The webinar is being recorded, and the slides and recording will be available for you within 3 business days. A short Q&A session will follow the presentation today to answer any viewer-submitted questions. During the webinar, you can submit questions you have using the webinar sidebar menu. Select the Questions tab, type in your question, then hit the Enter key on your keyboard. Remember, you can submit questions throughout the webinar. I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of Eurofins Food Assurance. Eurofins Food Assurance brings the group's food assurance businesses in North America, Europe, and Asia together under one business line. With over 25 years of experience in the testing, inspection, and certification industry, Eurofins Food Assurance offers customers the best support to identify and mitigate risks along their supply chain in terms of operation, processes, systems, or people. Clients in the food industries can benefit from a full scope of services from auditing, certification, training, and consultation to help eliminate potential risks in compliance, quality, and safety failures at the early stages of the supply chain, protecting brand image and minimizing the risk of product recalls and other undesirable scenarios. So at this time, I will turn it over to Tim. Tim, you may go ahead and begin your presentation.
Thank you, Amy. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're at. Again, my name is Tim Lombardo with Eurofins Food Assurance, and we're going to be doing a short course on food defense and intentional adulteration. We start with the beginnings, and back in 2002, we start all of this with the Bioterrorism Act of 2002, and the 4 different titles. Title I addressed emergency rooms. Title II addressed how people in laboratories primarily handle toxins and biological agents. Title III addressed the food and drug supply in the U.S. And then Title IV talks about the Safe Water Act. And so specific to food, we look at Title III. And then from Title III came the food safety, the FSMA with the FDA food regulations, the Food Safety Modernization Act. And we often talk about the Food Safety Modernization Act as one entity, but it's actually 7 different regulations and requirements that encompass everything from third-party certification, produce safety, intentional adulteration, which we're going to be talking about in this next half hour, 40 minutes, foreign supplier verification, sanitary transport, preventive controls for human food, as well as preventive controls for animal food. So these 7 components make up FSMA. And so FSMA, again, is not one regulation. It is actually 7. And so we talk about food defense, but other things that we need to look at are also food safety and food fraud. Food safety are those food safety programs that address the unintentional or accidental contamination of food, either during storage or processing. We look at the biological, chemical, and physical hazards associated with the foods or the processing step. And we associate that with our food safety plan. So either it's going to be a preventive controls food safety plan or a HACCP food safety plan. But this addresses the unintentional or accidental contamination of food. Whereas food fraud is intentional, but the motivation is primarily for economic gain. And so food fraud can come in lots of different forms. It could be substitution, so you replace a less expensive food for a more expensive food. You could dilute So adding water to milk, for example, diluting the water or diluting the milk. Addition, so you're adding things to get a higher test reading. So, for example, melamine in infant formula was added to give an artificially higher protein without actually having protein in that infant formula. Misrepresentation is also a form of food fraud, where we're showing or presenting something as a higher cost when it's actually a lower cost. And then tampering. Food fraud can occur either at finished products, with ingredients, with raw materials, or processing aids. So throughout the supply chain, food fraud can occur. Again, the primary motivation for food fraud is economic gain. It is intentional, and public health harm may occur, but that again is not the motivator. Food defense addresses the intentional contamination or tampering of food, and its primary focus is to prevent harm. So we have food safety, which addresses unintentional contamination. We have food fraud, which is intentional, but for economic gain, not to cause harm. And then we have food defense, which addresses all those things that are intentional and can cause harm. There is a regulatory compliance, so 21 CFR 121 is the regulation. And as of July last year, 2019, large facilities were to be in compliance. Small facilities, less than 500 employees, are to be compliant in July of this year. And very small facilities are exempt from the rule, but by July 2021, must document the reasons for that exemption. And the rule has a lot of information on how to file for those exemptions, the definitions of what a very small facility is, and then how to file for exemption. FDA has announced that routine inspections will begin for large facilities as early as March 2020. However, with COVID, almost all of FDA on-site inspections, whether it's for surveillance, for food defense, for anything else, have been halted until the travel restrictions have been lifted. And I believe that they are doing some live virtual inspections, specifically around foreign supplier verification. So the FDA is still working, but they're just not conducting on-site visits until the travel restrictions have been lifted. Some examples of what an intentional act has been reported to cause harm. In Minnesota, in 2016, a woman was sentenced to 90 days jail, fined $200,000 in damages, and 5 years probation. She was convicted of 2 felony counts of causing damage to property. And what happened was she was an employee of a chicken processor. She collected some sand and dirt from the parking lot and used it to contaminate the chicken that she was using, she was working on the line. The company recalled almost 28 tons of their chicken because of this intentional contamination. More recently, in Pennsylvania of this year, related to COVID, a woman was purposely coughing on fresh produce and a bakery and some meat and groceries in a grocery store. About $35,000 worth of food was thrown out. The woman was arrested and charged with 4 felonies, including terrorist threats, and 1 felony count of using a biological agent, which she was coughing and spitting on the food. And so even today, as a result of COVID, this is considered a biological agent to purposely cough or spit on product. When you're building your food defense plan, some things you need to take into consideration before you start working on that are the types of threats that are out there. And so you need to look at the attributes of food targets. So what kind of foods would be more susceptible to attack than others? And we're not looking at specific types of food from the standpoint of the produce or meat or ice cream. We're looking at the processes. So foods that are held in large batches, where contamination can be you can add a contaminant more easily in large batches versus small batches. Foods that have short shelf lives or rapid turnarounds allow for easier contamination and a more widespread contamination. Foods that have uniform mixing, so that way the contaminant is able to be easily spread throughout the entire batch, as opposed to isolated within a pocket of a batch. We also want to look at the attributes of agents. So what kind of contaminants are out there that are available for use? In the one example for the woman in Minnesota, she just went to the parking lot and pulled a bunch of dirt and gravel from the parking lot. The example in Pennsylvania this year, the woman had nothing other than she was just coughing and spitting on produce. And so what is available to be used as a contamination? And we look at biological, chemical, radiological, and physical hazards. We look at the ones that are normally associated with unintentional contamination. And we look at the ones that are very familiar to those who work in food manufacturing or food safety, because those are the agents that are available to be used for direct contamination. And then we also want to look at the employees. What are the attributes of the employees? Do we have what are the attitudes and what are the motivations of our employees? So all these things we want to consider when we're looking at our food defense plan. We need to consider the types of foods that we're manufacturing and the processing types. We need to look at the types of agents, contaminants that are available for use for contamination. And then we need to look at our employees and their attitudes and motivations for contamination. The next thing we want to take into consideration are the types of tactics that could be used in contaminating of our food. We want to look at insider compromise. That means that we have employees or anybody who has a legitimate access to the food. So it could be employees, it could be contractors, it could be temporary employees, it could be customers or visitors who come in and they have a legitimate reason to be in the facility and they might have a legitimate access to the food. We also want to look at exterior attack tactics, where the raw material is contaminated prior to coming to our facility. And then we use that in manufacturing of our finished goods. A forced entry tactic is where someone from the outside tries to come in to the facility, either by picking a lock or forcing a door open or stealing an access card or keys to enter a facility. And then there's covert entry, where there's deception that's used to gain entry. And so if you have a tour or with a customer group, or if you have a trial run and someone from another company is helping to conduct that, they may pose to be a member of that group and gain access to the facility in that fashion. So we want to look at how the attacker is coming into the facility. And we want to focus on these four means of someone entering the facility. So then we go into developing our food safety plan. The food safety plan has 6 steps, and they're outlined here by the regulation number. First step is we're going to conduct a vulnerability assessment. And then from those, we're going to develop our mitigation strategies. We're going to develop monitoring procedures, corrective actions, and record-keeping procedures. We're going to have verification and then reanalysis. And if this looks very familiar, it should look like HACCP, it should look like preventive controls. When we're developing our food safety plans, that's intentional. And so the intent is to follow a format that is very familiar to us in food manufacturing. And so the vulnerability assessment is the equivalent of conducting a hazard assessment or hazard analysis for preventive controls or HACCP food safety plan. Preliminary steps for developing the food defense plan is to assemble a food defense team. And just like with HACCP or preventive control food safety teams, we need to have a cross-functional, cross-departmental food defense team. The next step is to describe our products. It's useful to understand the types of products that we're using that we're going to be under the vulnerability assessment. Not only the types of products, but so not so much the type of product. Again, we're not concerned that it's so much ice cream, but the fact that it's a batch system or it's a continuously flow system. The hazards associated with that from a food defense perspective may be different for batch versus a continuous operation. We want to then develop a process flow diagram, just like we would for a HACCP or preventive control food safety plan. We want to do the same thing for our food defense plan, develop a process flow diagram. And we want to identify each point, each step, and each procedure where food is manufactured or processed. And then we want to describe our processing steps, a short description of what happens at each of those points, each of those steps, each of those procedures. And then we conduct our vulnerability assessment. The vulnerability assessment must be completed for each type of food manufactured, processed, packed, or held at the facility. So if you manufacture multiple different types of products, then you must have a vulnerability assessment for each. So if you, for example, if you're a dairy processor and you make cheese, and then from that cheese you might produce cream, you might produce whey, you need to have a vulnerability assessment for each of those different products. You need to have a vulnerability assessment for the cheese process, the cream process, and the whey process. And the vulnerability assessment needs to evaluate every point, every step, or every procedure. And we're looking at what's the impact to the public health in severity and scale if the contaminant was added. What's the degree of physical access to the product? What's the ability of the attacker to successfully contaminate the product? And the vulnerability assessment must always consider the possibility of an insider compromise or insider attacker. FDA considers this to be the most likely of all attacks, is that it's going to be someone from within the organization, someone within who has a legitimate access to the facility. FDA considers this to be the most likely of scenarios where contamination of our food system will occur. One way of conducting a vulnerability assessment is through the key activity type, or CAT. There are many acceptable options of conducting the vulnerability assessment. This is the one that FDA recommends, but there are others. And as long as you are addressing all the different considerations within the regulation, then you can use CAT or you can use any other type of vulnerability assessment. But this is the actual, where FDA actually prefers to see the key activity type. The CAT method takes into consideration all the requirements within the regulation of 21 CFR 121.130, which includes addressing the potential of public health impact, addressing the degree of physical access to the product, addressing the ability to successfully contaminate the product, plus the likelihood of the attack originating from within the company. So the CAT method for vulnerability assessment is what we're going to focus on for this webinar. And there are 4 key activity type descriptions. One is bulk liquid receiving and loading. Another is liquid storage and handling. Then secondary ingredient handling and mixing and similar activities. So we are going to do vulnerability assessments on these 4 processing steps. If you have your flow diagram and you identify all your different processing steps in that flow diagram, and if you have one that's bulk liquid or liquid storage or secondary ingredient handling or mixing, grinding, or similar activities, then we're going to do a vulnerability assessment only on that processing step. So these are the 4 key activities where we will do a vulnerability assessment. The other processing steps, we will not conduct a vulnerability assessment. Specifically for bulk liquid receiving and loading, it includes any bulk liquid that is received at and shipped from the facility. So if you're receiving a bulk liquid, say liquid sugar, then the receiving step of that bulk ingredient, liquid ingredient, must have a vulnerability assessment. If you're producing liquid sugar, then and shipping that to your customers, then the shipping step of that bulk liquid must have a vulnerability assessment conducted. So some activities to consider when you're looking at a vulnerability assessment for bulk liquid receiving and loading include the opening of transport vehicles, the opening of vent hatches and other access points, attaching pumping equipment or hoses, and the unloading or loading of the liquid material. So when you're conducting your vulnerability assessment, you need to consider these activities at a minimum and figure out, do they need mitigation strategies, which we'll cover in step 2. Another KAT point is liquid storage and handling, and this would include any bulk storage of liquid in silos or tanks. Would also include any liquid stored in totes or barrels, jugs, and jars once the tamper-evident seal has been broken and the liquid material still remains in there. So if you have a 50-gallon drum of liquid, once the seal has been broken and liquid material remains in that 55-gallon drum, then you need to have a vulnerability assessment around that. Activities to consider when you're doing your vulnerability assessments include any intermediate tanks that might be used for controlling the flow rate. And that's also to consider that an intermediate tank may be an open barrel or tote or jug with a pump that's installed on it. So instead of having a full fixed tank in place, you may be using a barrel as your intermediate tank, where you're just metering a little bit of a liquid in throughout the day's production. And at the end of the day, that barrel is unsealed and exposed. Secondary ingredient handling is another KAT point for the vulnerability assessment. And that's any point where you might have secondary dry or liquid ingredients that are added to the production line. These could be additives or processing aids, inclusions, minor ingredients. Again, they could be dry ingredients or liquid ingredients. And some activities to consider at this point are ingredient staging, ingredient prep, weighing, measuring, premixing, ingredient addition points, and then any rework as well. And then finally, the last method for the KAT vulnerability assessment includes mixing. Mixing, blending, homogenizing, grinding, milling, coating, roasting. All these are similar enough activities, and so FDA considers these to be all a KAT point for the vulnerability assessment. And so you might have a flow diagram that looks like the ground black pepper on the left, where you just have grinding as a KAT. Or you could have something more complex as the energy bar on the right, where you have liquid ingredients, you have secondary ingredients, you have blending or grinding operations, and so you may have multiple processing steps where you conduct a KAT vulnerability assessment. And then you would set it up on a flow or a form such as this, which is, again, very similar to Preventive Control Food Safety Plan or HACCP Food Safety Plan, very similar process. So we have step one, identifying the processing, the step number, and then step two is the processing step. For example, receiving shelf-stable ingredients. Step three is a process description. So what's happening at this step? Sugar and salt are received in 50-pound totes. Hydrogenated or vegetable oil is received in 5-gallon plastic pails that are tamper evident. The vulnerability assessment method that we used for this is our KAT, key activity type. And then the explanation for step 5 is this point step procedure does not fit within any of the KATs, and so this does not require a mitigation strategy, or it's not an actionable process step, and because it's not an actionable process step, it will not require a mitigation strategy. In the second example, where we have a mixing operation, it does fall within the KAT, and it will be an actionable process step. And so because it is, we need to have a mitigation strategy developed. Step 2 in our process is to develop our mitigation strategies. They need to be risk-based. Both mitigation strategies and the corresponding explanations must be written. They must be reasonably appropriate, and they must significantly minimize or prevent the significant vulnerability as identified in the actionable step. So very similar process again to our food safety plans, HACCP or preventive control, where the assessment is the risk-based and the mitigation strategies must be reasonably appropriate and must be able to minimize or prevent the vulnerability. Some things to consider when you're developing your mitigation strategies is the 3 elements from the vulnerability assessment. First is public health impact. How will your mitigation strategy reduce the impact to public health? How will your mitigation strategy reduce physical access to that point? And how will your mitigation strategy reduce the likelihood of a successful attack? So those are the considerations that we need to have when we're developing our mitigation strategies. We can develop a mitigation strategy, and we're going to focus on the inside attacker. So we have Technology-assisted mitigation strategies, tamper-evident tape or seals, locked gates, doors, or cages where only authorized employees have keys or ID cards. We can secure the unloading, loading hoses in locked cabinets, again, where only authorized employees have access. And we can use enclosed tanks and transfer systems for liquids as opposed to open balance tanks. We can use personnel-based mitigation strategies when we're developing our mitigation strategies. And the examples could be authorizing who should be in a particular area. So employees who would be responsible for excluding unauthorized persons from an area. You could use distinct uniforms or bump caps to identify the people who are authorized to be in a specific area. And then proper training of employees to ensure that if they notice someone who's not supposed to be in an area, then they identify that person to supervisors. Another type of mitigation strategy is operations-based mitigation strategy, where you could reduce the amount of time of staging of secondary ingredients. So in order to reduce access and limit the opportunities for intentional adulteration. You can relocate the staging or short-term storage of partially used ingredients to a more secure place. So when you have a partially used barrel of liquid ingredient or partially used bag of dry ingredient, instead of just putting them onto a pallet and leaving them in the warehouse, maybe you put them on a pallet and they go into a secured, gated area that has access only by authorized employees. So as we build our mitigation strategy, we're going to complete our form, and we have our step number. We note what our actionable step is. It's a liquid ingredient storage tank. We develop a mitigation strategy around that, and then we have a procedure in place for monitoring. So we use a lock to secure the access hatch on the ingredient storage tank. The employees are assigned to ingredient storage. They observe whether the lock is in place and ensure that the lock is in place before and at the end of the 40-hour cleaning cycle, something along those lines. Monitoring. Step 3. Food defense procedures for monitoring should include what will be monitored, how the monitoring will be done, how often monitoring will be done, what's the frequency, and then who will do the monitoring. Exactly the same as our preventive control and HACCP food safety plans set up for monitoring. And as with the food safety plans, our food defense monitoring procedures must be written. Corrective actions, again, the food defense corrective action procedures must be written. And the corrective action procedures must describe the actions that you would take to ensure that appropriate action is taken to identify the correction of a problem that has occurred within the implementation of a mitigation strategy, and when necessary to reduce the likelihood that the problem will recur. And then we update our form to include our corrective action procedures as well as our records of where the corrective actions will be documented. Step 5 is verification. So we need to conduct some verification that the food defense monitoring is being conducted. We have verification procedures that for appropriate decisions about food defense, corrective actions are being made. And verification of food defense corrective actions does not always require a review of those records. And so we need to have some sort of verification process in place. And then reanalysis. We must conduct a reanalysis of the food defense plan on whole or in at least every 3 years. Or whenever a significant change in activities has been implemented, or when we become aware of new information about potential vulnerabilities, or when we find that a mitigation strategy or the food defense plan as a whole is not being properly implemented. So at a minimum of every 3 years, unless there's a change or we're aware of new information about our vulnerabilities. And then we enter that information into our form. And this looks very much, again, like our food safety plan for preventive controls, or HACCP. Some additional tools and resources that we have available. Of course, there's the actual regulation, 21 CFR 121, and then there's a lot of guidance for industry information out there. That's also available from the FDA, which is very, very useful in whether you're a small entity or you want to learn more about mitigation strategies, conducting the vulnerability assessment. These are all very good and useful tools to give a current view of FDA's thinking. Other resources out there include the Food Defense Mitigation Strategies database, the Food Defense Plan Builder, a site called FreeB, Carver Shock, and then there's a National Agricultural and Food Defense Strategy. Again, a little bit about Eurofins is that we are a full service provider, including food safety services, micro testing, and chemistry testing. Our presence across the United States from coast to coast and in between. And our food safety services include training, consulting, and auditing pieces. We do have a full 2-day food defense course. It's May 19th and 20th. It's a live virtual offering, so you can sit and relax at home and spend the 2 days with us if you're interested in that course offering. And again, my name is Tim Lombardo with Eurofins, and that concludes my part of the presentation.
Thank you, Tim, for your presentation today. Now we'll move into a short Q&A. Feel free to continue to submit questions during this time, and we will follow up with the questions that we don't get to today. So, Tim, I just see a couple of questions that have come in here. The first one, and I think you've touched on that a little bit, with COVID-19, is the FDA enforcing food defense and intentional adulteration?
So, the requirement is there, yes. Enforcement on site, no, but the requirement is there. And so once the travel restrictions are lifted, then FDA will then continue to conduct their food defense inspections. But that doesn't mean that if you don't have your food defense plan and you're supposed to, then you better get to implementing your food defense plan.
Okay, great. And then one other question here. Is it accurate that the FDA seems to be focusing on our employees, the most likely source of intentional contamination?
Oh yeah, definitely. In the guidance material, that's really what their focus is when the FDA goes through the KAT vulnerability assessment. It's almost solely from an insider attacker point of view. How do we prevent and mitigate access to unauthorized employees or visitors?
Okay, great. Just waiting to see if we have any other questions coming in. One question here is with respect to, we are a small facility with only 12 employees. However, they're part of a much larger corporation. Do you have any guidance on the deadline for compliance?
If the company is still considered a medium-sized company or small company, less than 500 employees, then compliance date is this July. If you're if you're considered a very small entity and meeting the requirements within the guidelines, within the regulation, then you can ask for approval to not have compliance. So it depends on the size, depends on the amount of revenue that the company produces. Because there's a few considerations on whether or not you would be considered a very small company or a small company. And that's really the deciding point between complying or not.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you for that guidance. And then I think we have time for just about one other question here. Is there any public database to show known cases of intentional adulteration?
Not cleanly, but the National Agricultural and Food Defense Strategy website has some. The Food Defense Mitigation Strategies database also has some examples of what's been out there. So those are probably the first two places I would look.
Okay, great. Right. And I think that wraps up our Q&A session. And again, if there's other questions that do possibly come in after, we certainly will follow up with you to address those one-on-one. And I know I have received a lot of questions that have come in on the chat. So just a reminder to everyone that a recording of Tim's webinar, along with a copy of the slides, will be available within 3 business days. So again, thank you, Tim, for sharing your presentation and expertise with everyone today. And thank you so much again to everyone for attending.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.